Hello, I'm George Liston, CA, and welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. We have one president and 535 members of Congress. Together, they share specific responsibilities for the conduct of American foreign policy in ways set forth in the Constitution of the United States. As current events tell us, the relationship between a president and Congress on foreign policy issues is not always harmonious. This democracy depends, for its strength, on free speech and vigorous debate. When it acts in the world, it benefits from an informed citizenry and the healthy interaction of all the government's branches. Since it already seems clear that this century, still in its infancy, will provide us with foreign policy challenges of enormous severity, we can expect the President and Congress to be tested as never before. Fortunately, there is much that history offers us by way of useful experience. My guest is Don Wolfensberger, Director of the Congress Project at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Don, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you very much, George. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a delight to have you here, Don, and I can add to your title that you have long and very distinguished service on the staff of the U.S. Congress. And just as importantly, you've been a Peace Corps volunteer in Tanzania, which I think
that's correct.
Gives you props for our conversation. I would like to start in a way that absolutely delights me, because we're going to deal with our namesake, Woodrow Wilson, but in a way in which it certainly had never occurred to me before, because he is so much identified in the public mind with the ill-fated League of Nations and such. But there is a gripping story of his action as president that tells us a lot about a president, a Congress, and the use of war powers. And as you know, Don, because you wrote the piece that I read that really got my mind thinking about this, in about 1913, when Woodrow Wilson looks south to Mexico, he's tremendously discomfited by what he sees, and it begins to build an attitude in him that will eventually lead to American intervention in that country. First of all, John, just give us your sense of what did Wilson see and why did it alarm him so?
Well, first of all, he had put out a general statement on U.S. policy towards Latin America when he became president in 1913, that he really expected better relations with the countries in Latin America, especially if they hewed more towards a democratic way of governing. Mm-hmm. And when it came to Mexico, he saw, I think, his first opportunity to make a real statement, and that's when a democratically elected government took over after 42 years of dictatorship. But after just, I think, about 2 years, that government was overthrown by a military dictatorship. And unlike most nations in the world, Wilson refused to recognize the new regime as being legitimate. And he basically said that we are not going to recognize the government there until it agrees to hold free elections and have a constitutional system much like our own.
Mm-hmm. That's very well stated, Don, because you lay the background perfectly. And what Wilson's doing, I think, that I get from what you said, is that he's disturbed by this constitutional crisis in Mexico, the fact that that government, in his opinion, is not living up to democracy, and feels that our country has a right to act militarily, if necessary, on that basis, and eventually he will.
Yeah.
Does that give us something new, Don, in the way American power is used? That is to say, a president saying, we may just be going to war or using war powers on the basis of principle and the performance of another nation.
Yeah, I think that's different from some of the earlier interventions we saw by Taft, for instance, and by Teddy Roosevelt. Those were more geared towards protecting U.S. interests, whether it was citizens or property or whatever. In Wilson's case, he was really going to the mat on a matter of democracy, and he thought that this was a very important thing to defend elsewhere, especially our closest neighbor.
Yeah, so it's a president saying that he's disappointed with the performance of another nation is going to do something about it.
Exactly. He didn't threaten military intervention at the outset. He just said that we're going to do all we can to help that country see the light and have a freely elected system. So
yeah, I want to talk about that, his lack of an initial military threat and his own sense of what intervention meant versus what Latin Americans might think it meant. But tell me this, Don, do you see in this, and one of the first things that struck me as I read this piece of yours was that, my God, that's at least an early echo of the Make the World Safe for Democracy, Wilson, that we'll see as we eventually get our own country into World War I.
Exactly, exactly. He just thought that this was so important, that we had such a good system that the rest of the world would want to live under a similar free government, and so this was a driving force in his whole thinking about our relations with other nations.
Yeah. Now let's get to that intervention question, Tom, because by 1914 we will be sending the Marines in, literally. And Wilson, as you pointed out, didn't see this as intervention because his goal was not, in his mind, conquest. That was his. It was his rationale. But what did the Mexicans think about it?
The Mexicans, of course, thought this was intervention, and when we did have the troops there, they reacted very angrily to this and intended to unite the various factions in Mexico against the U.S. and what it was doing. And the initial difference was over a silly thing called a matter of tribute. After some of our sailors had been captured down there, they had landed to get some supplies, not with any type of intervention or military force involved, but they were captured briefly and then released. But the commander of the ship, the U.S. ship, demanded that there be a 21-gun salute from the Mexican Port Authority as a matter of respect for the dignity of the U.S., and that was refused. And so this was blown up into a much larger incident, and Wilson went to Congress 3 times during this period to update them on what was going on.
Absolutely perfect, Don, what you said. And that incident, by the way, took place in Tampico.
That's right.
And though it was a small thing and largely a ceremonial matter and a matter of getting proper respect, so to speak, it did become quite a big thing. And Don, when you say he went to Congress, this brings up one of the key points I wanted to get us on right early in our conversation. In what way does he go to Congress? Because after this thing gets a little ugly, we're going to have Marines going into Veracruz, and Congress endorsing that by a vote, and I've got the vote right in front of me, 337 to 37.
Right.
But is this congressional consultation, or is he just telling him that what's what he's doing?
Well, it really was an attempt at congressional consultation. I mean, when you make 3 addresses to joint sessions of Congress about a growing problem, I think that's important. He met separately then with the committee members of the House and Senate Foreign Affairs and Foreign Relations committees. He did have a text drafted of a use of force resolution, should it be necessary, and that's the one that you mentioned that was adopted by the House overwhelmingly. The Senate was debating it for several days, as the Senate is wont to do. In the meantime, something happened down there that caused us then to send in the Marines. And what happened was that Wilson had heard that there was a German ship coming with arms to supply this general who was in charge of Mexico. He decided to block that ship from coming in, and that then resulted in sending in more troops, and it just became, it sort of escalated.
Right. Would you, this is kind of hard to phrase, John. I'm asking you almost to imagine yourself back in those chambers in that day, in a sense of, well, you can do it because you're not just a mind reader in this sense, but you've had the experience of dealing with Congress so extensively. Do you think they were excessively deferential to the president and all of this? I mean, 337 to 37 is a pretty powerful vote.
Wilson had really laid this out as a gross insult to the U.S., and he had several small instances that seemed to add up to basically the Mexicans thumbing their nose at the United States, and we weren't going to take this kind of an insult. And so the Congress was deferential, certainly. That vote does reflect it, and people were angry, certainly. But then once we did intervene, you saw almost an instant backlash in the Senate, where some of the Republicans just thought that Wilson was overreacting on a silly matter of tribute about this 21-gun salute. And Congress had a varied response, shall we say. Once the troops were actually on the ground, then Congress began to think, well, was this really the right thing to do?
Wow, that's a very interesting point. And one of the reasons it interests me, Don, and you might see this coming from way off in the back of my mind forward, and that is the Gulf of Tonkin, half a century later. How do you compare that?
I would say it's very similar. If you look at the resolution, basically it gave the president blanket power to use the force necessary to exact the tribute that was then requested. In the case of Gulf of Tonkin resolution, of course, there was the allegation, at least, that some of our destroyers had been attacked by gunboats from North Vietnam. That vote occurred on the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was August 7th, 1964, as I recall, and there were only 2 senators that voted against it: Greening of Alaska, Wayne Morris of Oregon. I think it was unanimous maybe in the House. It was overwhelming in any event. Right. So it was very much the same type of thing, where you had an instant emotional response to an assault on U.S. forces, U.S. property, whatever, and Congress weighed in on the side of the president in those instances.
Right. Speaking of the first instance, Don, and the way it may or may not have been setting parameters and examples for the rest of the century, as we both know, the Mexican affair plays out with Venustiano Carranza taking over the government. We recognize them. Pancho Villa does not like that. We chase him around Mexico for a while, and then of course World War I makes this all
Right.
fairly much a moot point. But what would you say, Don Wolfensberger, are kind of the enduring lessons of this early 20th century experience?
I think Wilson really, the lesson finally came home to him when they were chasing Pancho Villa deep into Mexico, and they were actually ended up fighting some of Carranza's forces, the governing president and his forces. Wilson just realized that maybe I made a mistake. He admitted to his closest aide, yes, this was a matter of principle, but how far do you carry that principle? And I think he realized that we probably had over-involved ourselves, even though he certainly did not have intervention in mind, because it wasn't conquest, as you say, and that's how he interpreted it. But to the Mexicans, it was very much intervention. He ended up, uniting them against the U.S. In both the instances that we've talked about.
Right. We're doing so well with the use of history, thanks to you. I want to turn to another subject, another president, and go back even farther in history, if you'll indulge me, Don. Because one of the other major foreign policy concerns of the president and Congress traditionally, as with war powers in the first instance, is intelligence. Then this is really tricky, because we have a country that's dedicated, devoted to free speech. And of course, intelligence works on the basis of secrecy. And the most interesting example, and again, I thank you very much for pointing me in this direction, is when I read of George Washington, who, in addition to being called the father of the country, can also be called the first spy master. In fact, the British said that he simply outspied us, as their explanation for why we won that war. But I'm thinking, if we contrast Washington's very adroit use of intelligence as the head of the executive and the role of Congress in exercising oversight in this very sensitive area, where you have to balance secrecy versus transparency, we have the themes that have dogged us, perhaps, down through the last 2 centuries. Is that your sense? You got...
Very much so. You recall it was 60 years ago when we had the National Security Act of 1947, in which we created the CIA and much of our current defense establishment, the National Security Council, and so on. But I think the Congress realized the importance of intelligence even more so after World War II, with the onset of the Cold War and the need for it. And it was quite willing to trust the executive to do what had to be done in order to find out what the communists were up to, whether it was the Soviets or the Chinese or whatever. And so there was a lot of leeway, let's say, given to the intelligence agencies. And we didn't see that really change until Congress was reasserting itself in the mid-70s after Watergate, after Vietnam, where Frank Church, a senator from Idaho, had some hearings in which he basically called a lot of things that the intelligence agencies had been doing that were very shocking to our sense of what is right for a democracy to be doing. I think Church used the term for the CIA, a rogue elephant. He thought it was just running rampant and that it had to be reined in. And so that's when you saw the creation of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees shortly after that, in 1977 and 79, as I recall. But the idea there was to have committees that could operate, for the most part, in secret, but yet keep close tabs on what our intelligence agencies were doing. And there are about 16 of them altogether that are under the aegis of these two committees.
That's great, because we're going to turn to the performance of those committees and whether this mechanism of those committees is sufficient to the purpose of having oversight over intelligence. But just to get a sense of the atmosphere prior to the establishment of those commissions and prior to what we might call the several shocks of intelligence underperformance in America. I'm referring here to 1974, when the CIA was found to be spying on anti-war groups, when, and of course, 9/11 speaks for itself as an intelligence failure, and the weapons of mass destruction fiasco we've seen recently. So everything you've said has been an attempt to react to those kinds of things, make sure they didn't happen. But if you step back, Don, before stepping forward to that whole period of the Cold War, I was stunned to read and think about how clubby the relationship was between at least certain powerful members of Congress, and the Senate particularly, and the intelligence establishment. They were essentially working to keep oversight from really happening in an effective way. That might be too harsh, but I thought that was true.
Yes and no. We had Porter Goss here prior to his going to the CIA when he was the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. And he and Jane Harman, his counterpart on the Democratic side, had opposing views as to what the proper role of the Intelligence Committee was. Porter Goss, of course, is a former CIA agent himself. He thought the main thing that the Intelligence Committee should be doing is to give the intelligence agencies what they need to do their job successfully. She, on the other hand, thought Congress should act as more of a check on them to pull them back if they're going too far in one area or another. And so I think most people would agree that you've got to have both. You've got to give the intelligence agencies what they need to do the right job, do it effectively. On the other hand, you've got to make sure that they're not doing improper things that will later come back to embarrass us. And this has happened time after time when these things are exposed. So we've always had that. And I think there's a danger in any committee, even if you look at, let's say, a Commerce Committee or whatever, where they become too involved with the agencies that they're overseeing and the clients that those agencies are serving, whether it's business interests or agriculture or whatever. So some people call this clientitis, where you become sort of overcome or subsumed by the people you're supposed to be overseeing. And this can happen.
It can happen, and with the select committees, which are now responsible for performing the oversight you're talking about, is it happening, or are they an effective vehicle? Maybe that's a more neutral, better way of phrasing the question. Or are there things that we need to do even now to improve the oversight function of Congress?
Well, that's a good question. The 9/11 Commission thought that things as they're currently constituted were not sufficient, that the intelligence committees, even when they tried to demand certain things of the intelligence community, they weren't being paid attention to because they didn't have the money clout. The appropriations committees handle that. The authorizing committees, the intelligence oversight committees, don't really have the money behind them to get the reports they want on a periodic basis or whatever it might be. So what the 9/11 Commission recommended is either get a joint committee of the House and Senate that would have more clout, or give the existing intelligence committees the appropriating authority. Congress has turned both of those down. They've now tried something that's much weaker in the House, where they have an oversight subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee that looks at intelligence, but the money is still coming out of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, not out of this new intelligence subcommittee.
I want to talk about oversight of funding as a good way for Congress to actually maintain oversight over anything when you get down to it.
Exactly.
But on this question of the committees, select committees overseeing intelligence as things are today, I'll sound very innocent and naive on this one, Don, but a select committee, that's really a function of the Speaker of the House selecting the members of it?
Yes, the Speaker of the House appoints all members to a select committee, whereas other committees, the standing committees, are first of all nominated by their caucuses and then elected by the House.
Is there any sense that an Intelligence Oversight Committee might be better if it were elected as opposed to being, or is that an issue at all? Not an issue.
It could be an issue. I tend to doubt that it would be. I think the main reason that they gave the Speaker that authority in the House, and the same thing applies in the Senate with the President pro tem of the Senate, is that they want to make sure they get the right people on there, not in the sense of being partisan loyalists so much as people that are not going to embarrass the committee and the House or the Senate by leaking things or by grandstanding too much or something of that nature. So that's the reason they did it. Now, is there a danger that the Speaker or the leader in the Senate can be pulling strings in other ways for political or partisan purposes? Yes, there's that danger. Some people had thought that perhaps when Nancy Pelosi was the minority leader, that she was egging Jane Harman, the ranking member on the Intelligence Committee, too much to be more partisan with the Bush administration, and that's the reason Jane Harman wasn't then appointed chairman when the Democrats came into the majority. So that's one theory. There are other theories too, but it's certainly the prerogative of the Speaker to appoint all the members, not just the chair.
Right. You mentioned funding oversight and breaking off intelligence as a specific oversight responsibility in the funding sense for Congress. When you get down to it, isn't the funding vehicle Congress's main way of having oversight over anything? And if that is true, and I gather that really probably is true, that in this era we live in of continuing resolutions, massive appropriations bills, we don't have the kind of, at least close scrutiny I think I remember.
No, that's so true, but I don't think it's ever been there in a real sense on intelligence appropriations from the beginning, because the defense part is so much bigger and so much of a concern to members because of defense bases and everything else that the Appropriations Committee gives scant attention, from what I've heard, to what is going into that so-called $43 billion secret budget of the intelligence community. And I think that the reason is that members don't want to be bothered with that. They don't want to really know some of the secrets. When somebody asks, well, how many of these members have gone to look at the classified annexes that back up this funding, you could count them on your two hands.
Are they all cleared to do it?
They're all cleared to do it. They have to swear an oath of secrecy in order to have access to classified materials. I think most every member does that, but they're entitled to look at it, but most members just decline to look at it because I think a lot of them are afraid that they might let slip in a conversation such as we're having with something that's classified and they forgot that they had learned that from the classified annex as opposed from a public report. So.
Sure. I mean, that would terrify me, Don, to be quite honest, and I probably would make that mistake. But on the other hand, unless they do that, we're going to end up with, and right now in the wake of at least the first round of Iraq intelligence, we're having all sorts of recriminations over what should have been known and what was misinterpreted.
And that's why members tend to trust the experts on the committees, whether it's intelligence or agriculture or defense, to take the real lead and look into these matters. But your larger point is correct too, and that is that most committees are not doing a good job of oversight of the agencies' programs that are under their jurisdiction. The reason being that there's not a lot of glamour to that unless you've got a scandal or an investigation or something, but the solid oversight that's needed to oversee programs is not something that members really want to wade into. So you might have one or two experts in the Congress on a particular agency or program, but other than that, most committee members don't really ask that they have a lot more hearings on oversight. They want the glamour and the credit for new program initiatives.
Very human.
Yes.
Your mention of the word agriculture made me remember something, Don, I know that you know all too well, and that is, in our conversation today, we've been focusing on war powers and intelligence, such as some major foreign policy interests the President and Congress have to work out between themselves. But almost anything the U.S. Congress gets involved in has a foreign policy dimension, doesn't it? I mean, agriculture, for example, trade, immigration, obviously. So right across the board, you've got every committee potentially affecting the way we do business with the world.
Very much so. In fact, I sort of named a corollary to Tip O'Neill's axiom that all politics is local. A lot of local politics today is global. So much is tied in with what's going on in the global economy that affects not only agriculture but local industries that might be relocating offshore and you name it. All of our trade agreements affect things. So there's a lot there that members should be concerned about. They are when it hits home, certainly, but there are a lot of foreign policy aspects that members don't pay attention to because it's nothing that affects their constituents directly.
Give me a sense of how the foreign relations committees work in this sense, Don. I know it's probably too late in my life to get much benefit from a really extensive civics class, but with this plethora of foreign policy interests, do the foreign affairs committees themselves harness all of this, or are they consulted, or are they just acting independently?
Well, consulted by the administration, you mean, or
no? Internally in the House, when a committee, the Agriculture Committee, for example, is dealing with a bill, ethanol, corn, affecting Iowa, our Midwest, is there any consultation at all with the people working in foreign relations, or is there
very little? I think you'd get more with the people that are on the Ways and Means and Finance Committee in terms of trade, as one example, but. There's not a lot of consultation. The House of Representatives has the advantage, some would say the disadvantage, of having what we call multiple referrals. When a bill affects more than one committee, it goes to all of those committees. The Senate tends to stick with one committee. The committee that has predominant jurisdiction gets that bill. So a lot of people say that there's some advantage to having this cross-fertilization among committees, even though it slows things down a little initially to get through all the hearings and the markups that are involved. But I think it has a beneficial aspect too, and that's the consultation that you raised.
Sure, and wouldn't, I mean, I guess I have the advantage of ignorance, having never been in the Congress, but it seems to me in a globalized world where everything we do has these ramifications, even if it slows the process down, the wider, within reason, of course, a degree of consultation, the better off we are legislatively and
very much
diplomatically.
So. Very much so. And of course, the problem that you've seen in the last several years when Congress has had much shorter work weeks is the committees really haven't had time to do their basic authorizing the bills that they're expected to put out every year, let alone do the oversight and the type of consultation that you would expect in some of these areas. So hopefully now with the committees moving towards 5-day work weeks, or at least 4-day, I think the 5-day may be going the way already of the dodo, but I think members are committed to having more committee work now, a greater oversight. So maybe there's some hope that this will bring back a greater amount of deliberation, which is certainly needed on the Hill.
As we come close to the end of the conversation, I'm going to toss you an impossible philosophical question we can debate for the next 10 years or so, Don. But I think someone, or maybe many people, have described our Constitution in terms of the relations between Congress and the President on foreign policy issues as, quote, an invitation to struggle. And others have said, and I think quite rightly, that our government functions best when there's a kind of a co-equal sense of power in this very delicate arena. What's your sense of that? Do we really
Well, I think Edward Corman was exactly right when he did say that when it comes to foreign policy, the Constitution is an invitation to struggle between the branches, and that I think we are better off if there is more of a balance, but at the same time we recognize the President has to take the lead in so many foreign policy matters once he's authorized on the use of troops, use of force for our troops elsewhere, that he's got to be Commander-in-Chief. So there's always going to be, I think, something of an imbalance that in the 20th century and now in the 21st century, the executive does take the lead, certainly, but Congress still has a very vital and important role to play, and it is really reflecting the views of the people, the sentiment of the people. And I think Edmund Burke once said that no war can go on for long if the will of the people is against it, and that's something Congress is constantly channeling public sentiment, and that's what we're seeing now on Iraq, and we see it on a lot of other matters that come along. And so, hopefully Congress is there as a sounding board to at least alert the executive to where the people are coming from, where they see the problems being, and so on.
Right.
And I think the people have a good inherent instinct towards what is right and what is wrong, and we're just seeing this being played out in the Congress and the debates we're having on our current Iraq policy.
So what you see going on right now, what we all see going on right now, is very much in the spirit of what we should be doing.
I think so, and I think the President recognized that when he told both the Democrats at their recent retreat and the Republicans that he welcomes a debate. He knows that there's going to be opposition, but this is a part of our tradition. So I think it's healthy as well, even though some people think that this is harming maybe the morale of the troops or encouraging the enemy or whatever, but this is part of our democracy.
Vigorous debate indeed, and something we rely upon. I fully agree with you, Don. And I thank you very much for being with us on Dialogue today. The first, I hope, of many visits.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed.
I look forward to more. And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. John, thank you.